Good evening, everyone. I'm Barbara Peters from the Poison Pen in Scottsdale, Arizona. And through the miracle of Zoom, we are together with Jesse Kellerman, Berkeley, California, and Jonathan Kellerman in Beverly Hills, and Patrick Milliken, who's down at the Poison Pen. I'll get to him in a minute. What I wanted to say was this is so much fun to have another Kellerman family event. We have had Jesse, in fact, we met Jesse with Sunstroke in 2006. Jesse, until COVID, had been here for all of his books. Jonathan has been here with Jesse. Jonathan's been here with Faye Kellerman, his wonderful, talented writer wife. And then at one point, we had the whole Kellerman family at least once. But were we minus one daughter, Jonathan?
We were minus two daughters who haven't written books. They've gone to the dark side and become clinical psychologists.
Oh no, they went over to the black side where you are, huh? Okay.
I know. I'm very proud.
Well, anyway, thank God that we have Zoom and that we can do this again. Yeah. And with us, but about to disappear, is Patrick Milliken. And Patrick, do your little spiel about your role in this operation.
Sure, yeah. My spiel is that I will be monitoring the comments field here on Facebook. So if you have questions for Jesse or Jonathan, go ahead and put them in and I'll be happy to ask anything. Also, I will put a link. We are expecting autographed copies of The Burning imminently, and I'll go ahead and put a buy link in the comments field should you wish to purchase one. Spiel concluded.
Thank you very much, Patrick. Both authors have signed our copies, which is why there's a slight delay. The books are somewhere between Berkeley and Beverly Hills, or possibly in Beverly Hills, but anyway, they will make it to Scottsdale. Say thank you, Patrick. Gentlemen, I'm going to drink a toast to you. It's so wonderful to see you.
Great to see you.
Great to see you, Barbara.
And now I have my screwy question, Jonathan, because it reminded me when I poured this, that when we had dinner together in May, you served a really wonderful red wine. And I've never asked you this question, because as you know, my husband knows less about Judaism than any living person, even though he is Jewish. What's the difference between French wine, let's say, or whatever, and kosher wine? How is a wine kosher?
Well, kosher wine can be from anywhere. There's this stereotype that kosher wine is this sickly sweet Manischewitz stuff, but actually the Jews were making wine 3,000 years ago. It's quite, and that's how the Romans and the French got it. It started there. It's quite common in Israel to uncover a 3,000-year-old wine press. So wine is a big part of Jewish culture. And I'd say for the last 30, 40 years, they've gotten heavily back into it. And kosher wine comes from California, from Napa, from Israel, from Chile, from Australia, from France. There's some Grand Crus. It's one of those things that really, I hate to say it, because when people talk about kosher, they always are under the misconception that it's the rabbi gives it a blessing. But when it comes to wine, that's basically it. You have a rabbi overseeing it, and that's about it. And it's the same wine. You know?
So it's not the grapes, it's just a process or something. I'm sorry, Jesse, what?
No, just that, just for anyone who might be interested in this, and then we can talk about books, but anyone who might be interested, you know, when we talk about things being kosher, that means several different things. It means that there are certain ingredients that people who observe kosher don't consume at all in any form. So that would be things like pork and shellfish. Those are the well-known things. Those are just verboten completely. It also, kosher subsumes the category of how things are prepared. So people who observe the stricter form of kosher don't eat certain foods in combination like meat and milk. It can also mean the way, the kinds of dishes you keep, like those who keep a kosher kitchen often have separate sets of dishes for dairy and meat, all the way down to something like wine, which is essentially identical to any other wine, but the production of it is being overseen by someone with religious authority.
Yeah, but it's the same wine. So some of the Grand Crus in Bordeaux do a kosher cuvee. Chateau Villandrod's been doing it since 2000. Some of the great French wines, Margaux, Medoc, they have kosher versions of it. That's essentially the same thing. And Israel is producing an amazing amount of very, very good, top-rated wine. They have international winemaker, a wine master living there. Napa has been huge. One of our good friends, Jeff Morgan, is a winemaker. He owns his own winery. He used to be in Napa. He lives in Berkeley now, but it's the key is a great wine. And of course, I would only serve you great wine.
Well, you did serve me great wine,
Yeah,
which is
I have a
what
lot
made
of
me
it.
think of it.
I have a lot of it because we don't drink that much and we keep buying it. So,
Well, I hope when you and Faye are finally able to get to Israel and your new and beautiful apartment there, that you
Yeah.
can explore all these Israeli wines. However, as Jesse pointed out, we're actually here to talk about the book. So why don't we do that? And it seems to me that in order to really talk about this book, we need to talk about first the fires and the sort of almost, I could say ludicrous. I shouldn't say sinister because that's not fair, because I think it's just, it's not intentional. The role of Pacific Gas and Electric in the disaster. I mean, I remember cursing them when I was an undergraduate at Stanford in 1958, and apparently they have not gotten it together since. So Jesse, since you're up in Berkeley and that's where the book takes place here, the burning, how are the fires?
Well, actually this year we've, so far, I don't want to jinx anything, but we've gotten away pretty easy this year. At least for us in Berkeley, there's certainly been fires, and for the people that are affected by it, it's been, a disastrous thing. But the experience that we had last summer of smoke drifting in from every conceivable direction, and the air being chokingly thick with ash, the light, I'm sure you remember, most people saw the images of San Francisco that one day where the sky turned a deep burnt orange. It looked absolutely apocalyptic, and it was dark, most of the day. The sun never rose that day. So that was the context as I was writing this book. The interesting thing is that I was not drawing on that experience as I was writing. I was drawing on the fires of 2 seasons prior. That was what was in my mind when I sat down to write, when I sat down to work on those scenes. It just so happened that they were recurring during the actual writing, which gave it a real immediacy. And you talked about PG&E. Yeah, PG&E. Look, they're never named in the book. They're only referred to as the utility, like in sort of like a Harry Potter, the utility that shall not be named kind of way. I realize this is a complicated issue. I'm not going to weigh in it, but suffice it to say that PG&E and I are not good friends. They're not good. We're not good friends.
When we were conceiving the book, I think both of us were very much taken by Ross MacDonald, and one specific book he wrote, The Underground Man, which has as a backdrop a forest fire up in the Santa Barbara area. And I always thought that was a very interesting juxtaposition. So when we're conceiving the book, I brought that up. I said, you've had all these fires. Without it overpowering the story, I think it would be a good element to play off against.
Well, it's a really great background thing because I mean, the air quality is so poor. People are frazzled. People are upset. It's not just the air quality being poor; it's the lack of electricity. So there's no air conditioning. It's really hot. You can't charge your phone. So people are hanging out at the office because if they have generators at the workplace. I thought of that because we put in a generator here at our house after observing California for the last 2 years. Arizona is vulnerable too. And I said to Rob, we can't function without electricity.
We have experienced fires here in the south of California. Faye and I were among the fortunate people who evacuated Malibu several years ago. It took us 6.5 hours to travel 35 miles. With the fire paralleling us to the east, and had the wind shifted, we could have been immolated. It was quite an experience. So this has been an interesting couple of years, but we maintain our perspective. We didn't want to write an apocalyptic book. Make no mistake, this is a crime novel. This is a fast-moving, action-packed crime novel. But the fires and the environment had their role to play in this particular book, and I don't want to say too much more about it.
No, I mean, it's a huge background thing. And I really thought of you two because we were in Seattle maybe 3 summers ago when they were having those terrible fires. And it was so difficult to breathe and it was so unpleasant. And we went out to the Olympic National Park and you couldn't see anything, because the particles in the air just obscured everything. And so we left and came home. So I think if you haven't experienced a fire like this, this book will really shock you.
Yeah.
It's just overwhelming.
And it's
But
relevant up to the last page, up to the denouement, which is a real heart stopper. It's relevant. It plays a role,
Yeah.
but it doesn't overpower the book. It's still
Yeah.
a crime novel.
I agree. I agree with what my dad is saying, that at the core of this is still a ticking clock kind of story, a pressure cooker that we put our lead character Clay Edison in. I think, it obviously it does bear on the plot, but I think most of all what the fire and the environmental stress provide is this sense of just crushing menace, that mirrors in a very not subtle way the internal stress that Clay is experiencing.
Right.
And it's just it really shows both for him, and something that's become eminently clear over the last few years, like how close, the very thin line between civilization and complete chaos, it breaks down real fast.
Yeah.
Real fast. It's really there, but for the grace of God go we all. So that was the feeling I had during the fires, and it's a feeling I've had again and again throughout the pandemic. And without making a book about any of those things, I wanted to tap into some of those emotions, because they contribute to a pulse pounding story.
So when we've talked before, this is the fourth book for the Clay Edison series. Jesse,
Yes.
you're the one who done a deep dive into the actual role of a deputy coroner. You've got him up in
Yes.
Alameda County. Clay Edison
Yes.
is his name. And but so let's talk about that. But then I want John to talk about, there's some wonderful psychological sessions, whatever you want to call them, in the book, where you really explore character in a way, John, that you've talked to me. You and I have had conversations about your long clinical practice, and I felt like, in the end, this is one voice. This is not Jesse, not Jonathan, but it's their combined voice. But it takes different levels of expertise and so forth to make it all work. So Jesse, what is the role of a deputy coroner?
Right. So I'll talk about one half, and then I think, Barbara, touching on what you described, I'll pass it off to my dad, which is that the role of a deputy coroner up here in Alameda County is really twofold. They wear two hats. Up here, and it's different in every place. Every county, every law enforcement catchment area in the country has a different way of doing things. They even have different names for this title. Some people, in some places, it falls under the rubric of the medical examiner. Some places it's the coroner medical examiner. Some places it's the coroner. Up here in Alameda, it's the coroners, which is a branch of the sheriff's department. The coroner himself is the sheriff. And all the deputy coroners who investigate death are peace officers. They're sworn deputy sheriffs. So that reflects one half of the job, which is they're charged with determining the manner of death when someone dies under unusual or suspicious circumstances. And manner of death refers not to the thing that killed the person; that's the cause of death. But it's a categorical judgment as to whether the death was homicide, suicide, natural, accidental, or undetermined. Whenever somebody, and I should be clear that most deaths don't come to the coroner. There's only certain cases which are brought to the attention of the coroner, either because they're suspicious, because of the age of the decedent, or for a variety of other reasons. But once a coroner takes over the case, they have to make a judgment as to which of those five categories of death fits into. The cause of death, that's a separate determination that is made by the pathologist, who is a physician, right? So in the case of somebody who is struck on the head, the cause of death might be a brain hemorrhage. The manner of death could be a homicide if someone strikes him with a crowbar. It could be a suicide if he jumps off a building and hits his head. It could be an accident if a flagpole falls over and knocks him on the head. So those are two separate distinctions. One is medical and one is legal. So they're in charge of gathering the facts and taking care and custody of the deceased body and the possessions that are on the deceased at the time of death. They take custody of those things, and they hold the body for autopsy until it is ready to be released. So that's sort of the investigative clinical side of their job. But there is a second very important side of their job, which is much more psychological. And Dad, do you want to speak to that portion of it?
Well, and it's done differently. I mean, the funny thing about this is when I, for many years, had wanted to do a book featuring a coroner's investigator, which in LA is a totally different thing. The CIs there are generally retired cops, nurses, social workers who work with the coroner, and they're civilians. And I had it all planned and worked out, and we sat down to write it, and we decided to do it up in Northern California, and it's totally different there. So of course we had to adapt. Psychological part of it is that the interesting thing about Alameda, in some cases, it's detectives who actually go out and notify families. The detectives, if they're solving a murder. In Alameda County, it's these deputies who are coroners, who work for the coroners. It's one of their jobs is to go out and notify. So obviously a good degree of psychological sensitivity is called for. But just going back to what you said about voice, it's funny you should say it. When we did our first book together, I sent it to Stephen King, and Steve said, I know your voice, I know Jesse's voice, this is a new voice. So I thought that was the greatest thing. And that's what we aim to do. And even though somebody might think they can pick out who's done what and does, yes, I am trained as a psychologist, but you don't have to be a psychologist to understand people. Ruth Rendell was not a psychologist, and she really wrote great psychological novels. And Jesse, he does have a BA in psychology from Harvard. But I think it's just his depth as a human being and his understanding of people he's able to give quite a bit. But it's just a collaborative type of thing. And we don't want people can guess who did what, who said what. Like we had this one line that the New York Times loved in one of our books, and they couldn't figure out who said it, and they'll never know because that's our secret. So it's really is an interesting process. We've done a lot of books together and it's been a lot of fun. The other thing that we made a very definite decision in this book, I believe it originated with Jesse. The previous Clay books, they're certainly not leisurely paced, but because he's often dealing with a cold case, it can go on for weeks, even months. This takes place over days. This is fast moving. This takes place over days. There's an urgency. This is Clay in a different type of situation where he's not only dealing with a homicide, he's dealing with profound personal issues because there's a possibility that his brother Luke, who is an ex-con who served time for manslaughter because he drove drunk and killed people in his car, he might very well be involved in this story. And so Clay is just driven. He's driven. He needs to find out for obvious reasons.
But you did a really nice balance, between the pacing, which, as you point out, is really urgent because it's an ongoing thing rather than a cold thing. But, you also, because of the tense relationship, which you have to explore between Clay and his missing brother, Luke, you have to explore their character in real depth. And, I found that a very interesting pattern I don't quite know what the word, a very interesting mix in the book to read it, that we're zooming along and then, sorry for the zoom, that used to mean something, it was a real verb, right? Just like gay used to mean something different as an adjective. It's hard to keep up with language mutating. But I like the fact that, you've got these pulse pounding moments, and then you also have to pause and really explore these characters. So when you're writing together, how do you sort out the pace?
You do a lot of planning. Go ahead.
Yeah. I was just going to say, like the outlining is where that stuff, where the structural elements are put in place. And I think the pacing of any individual scene is really something that you have to feel out in a moment when you're writing. When we outline, we do a pretty detailed outline. We know we need to take Clay from this location at this time doing this thing to this location and this time doing the next thing. But how he's gonna make that transition and how much time we spend there, I think really when you start to write the scene and the characters start to speak for themselves, they, in a strange way, sort of determine the pace of the scene. And we appreciate that mix of, it is a very frantically paced novel, but to all of a sudden slow things radically down, that creates a sense of heightened contrast and drama that I think actually, because if it was just nothing but frenetic and you just really never got a chance to catch your breath and you never got a chance to spend some time dealing with the emotional ramifications of what Clay is going through, it would feel hollow in some way, and I'm reminded of something I heard Lee Child say on a panel once. He said, you write the fast parts slow and the slow parts fast. And I thought that was very, very wise. It's sort of like in the movie The Matrix, when time slows down and you see the bullet moving at a snail's pace. There's great drama in seeing this thing that objectively is moving very fast, but seeing it move very, very slowly heightens tension and allows things to be even more rich, meaningful, and suspenseful when they do pick up again.
Well, it's like chamber music. There's usually 5 movements in a chamber piece, and there's almost always a slow movement, but they usually end up presto.
Right.
They usually end up the fastest pace. Not always, but usually. And in terms of pacing it, it's all about planning. And this is true of the books I write by myself too. I would say planning, outlining, thinking, conceiving is about half the year. And then once I feel in control of that, writing, it takes up another 6 or 7 months. So it's pay me now or pay me later. I have found for myself, I know there are writers, wonderful writers, Parker and Dutch Leonard, who didn't outline. I'm not that smart. I think Jesse is that smart, but he likes to outline too. And Faye likes to outline. And I just think it gives you a sense of confidence where you know where you're going, and it avoids writer's block, which I've never experienced. And once again, to digress again, the famous Bob Parker, who I adored, and we were at a symposium once, this really pretentious, arty symposium. And among the things he was asked, Mr. Parker, what inspires you to write? And he said, I have a contract. And then someone said, what about writer's block? He said, when you call a plumber, does he say, I can't come because I have plumber's block? So, but he was that kind of guy. But just the planning, the conceiving, it really lays everything out. We do a lot of talking. We live in different cities, but we do a lot of chatting, and we visit. I fly up there, he flies down here. And we just, I thought I was a perfectionist till I started working with Jesse. Jesse really wants it all buttoned down. And I think
Hey, he's a product of you and Faye. What did you
I guess. I think to some extent, correct me, son, it comes from working in theater too, where you're working collaboratively and it's complex and you have so many people to deal with. You really want to understand things like motivation before you go on stage.
There's 100%. There's definitely a lot of it that is just a practice, and I'm used to dry running things a million times before they ever see life. But it's also just a function of being an extremely neurotic person who really just needs to have everything laid out. And I think that has been one of the great benefits and release of collaborating with my dad, which is that he's so practiced and so professional. He doesn't, he's done this a million times, and so he comes to every new book with great confidence that there will be a book. And I'm getting there. I've written enough books now that I don't have like imposter syndrome when I sit down, but there's always a moment about halfway through when I'm ready to throw my hands up, and the ability to punt to my dad is a great luxury.
Yeah, and I found that when I wrote with Faye also, we did a couple of novellas, and both of us felt, hey, if I paint myself into a corner, I just hand it off like a relay race. As long as you know that it's a collaboration and you approach it from that perspective. And we've had a wonderful time writing these books. And I'm just so thrilled about this particular book because I just think it's a really page-turning book. That's always
it is. But let's talk about Clay for a bit, because he's our lead guy. This is his 4th investigation. But you really have to dig into Clay's marriage, his family background, his relationships. Now, I know both of you have long-term, really happy marriages, and I'm happy to say that Clay apparently has, so far anyway, he has I don't trust you guys. It could all go south. But
Well,
anyway, he does have, for the moment, he has a very happy marriage. He has a daughter that he adores. His wife is pregnant, so that's all good. But then you discover that his own parents, that's a difficult relationship. And his relationship with his brother, which is the key to this whole book, is really, I don't even know how to describe it. John, tell us how would you describe
tortured.
it?
It's tortured.
Yeah.
It's tortured because Luke has been a lost soul for most of his life, all of his adult life. He's done some terrible things that Clay, as a cop, would find repellent and does, but it's still his brother. So the question in the outset of this book, is his brother a suspect or is he a victim? And that's what you're going to have to read to find out.
I think we're both family men. We both, marriage and family are the axis around which both our lives turn. And in terms of Clay's own personal relationship with his wife, it is a happy marriage. At least for now, it's a happy marriage. And I think, Dad, I think you'd probably agree that was by design. We didn't want to make his personal angst part of the story, both because that's been done a lot, and second of all, it's not my impression that the people who do this job well are people who experience a great deal of personal turmoil. You have to bring a kind of clear-headedness and personal, almost inner peace to this job in order to do it effectively. It's not true for all cops in every area of police work, but this particular group of people, they're a fairly stable bunch of people, at least in my personal experience. And also, I think it's worthwhile to see a stable, happy, working family portrayed in fiction. Which is not to say that they're, we're not Pollyannish about it, and the relationships have the same stresses that we all have and all experience. And as you said, his relationship with his parents is tense. His relationship with Luke is very, very fraught. And it may be because of the fraught nature of those relationships that he's really hungering for something to have a better, more stable family life. That's an aspiration for him.
Well, when I started writing and publishing in the 80s, the antihero was a cliche by that time, and I was determined to avoid cliches. It's still a cliche. Every other hero or heroine you read about has a physical defect or a terrible trauma, and I don't find it interesting anymore because it's yon yon yon. It's a cliche. The harsh truth. I don't care what your job is, you're going to do a better job, be it being a novelist or being a cop, if you are physically and mentally healthy. It's just easier to do your job. Hollywood always has a portrayal of the writers being screwed up, and there's some justification for it because there's a definite relationship between creativity in certain fields and writing fiction, poetry, and mood disorders. I'm fortunate not to have suffered from it because it can be debilitating, but it's become a cliche, and there are happy writers. There's a lot of them, and a lot of the successful ones are very happy. There's no shame in being happy and enjoying your life, which is not to say that Clay's life is easy. He has just a fraught relationship with his brother, with his mother, with his work, but it's normal type of stress. I remember we were once trying to do a network deal for some Delaware books many years ago, and the genius executive said, well, he should have a limp. Everything's fine, but Delaware needs to have a limp. Why? So we don't have to put in limps when there are none, because life will dish out its own limps.
Well, one of the things that you write about, although I don't want to suggest that in any way this departs from the urgency of the novel, is that you have a look back at Clay's basketball career and the knee injury that blew him out, and what that meant to him. But it also, John, and this is where I detected you, you talk about his mother who had invested herself in her younger child's career, and all of a sudden it goes south, and now she feels really guilty that her older child, who is a more difficult case and so forth, that she hasn't spent enough energy on him compared to Clay. And now she's enabling Luke, who,
Oh, yeah,
you know,
definitely.
like,
Definitely.
and I felt like, you know, enablers don't really see the damage they're doing, do they?
No. And Luke has a wife too, so to complicate it further. So
Yes, and she's a real piece of work.
he is a piece of work. He's a piece
Yeah.
of
And you know, while we talked about marriage, one of the other things that you really bring out in this book, I think, is parenting. You know, I mean, you give Clay time, Jesse. You know, you have a young family. You give Clay time to talk to his daughter on the phone. They're down in Southern California, getting away from the fire. But you know, I love his interaction with his little daughter.
Yeah, I mean, I think we had to make a decision when it came to this series as to whether we were going to advance him sort of in real time through life and through the various stages of life and give him a family and give him, in some ways, it's easier to not saddle him with a child and a marriage and people he's responsible to, because that's inhibiting, right? You can't take risks in the same way that you would if you were a lone wolf out there, a vigilante prowling the streets of America. We decided to do it anyway. I think for us, you know, the fact that he does have these things at stake is in some way a dramatic asset, because it creates a lot of personal strife and stress when he has to do things that put him in harm's way. He's not the only person he's responsible to. He's responsible to a wife. He's responsible to a child. And frankly, that is the reality that most people who do dangerous jobs face. There's a lot of people out there who wake up in the morning, kiss their wife or their husband and their kids goodbye, and then have to go out and put themselves in harm's way, whether that is in law enforcement, whether that's somebody working in a coal mine. There are lots of jobs where your physical well-being is not guaranteed, and yet those people get up and do it and come home to their families at the end of the day, knowing that they might not come home the next day. You know, I am currently in the throes of raising little children, so all that stuff is very, very present for me right now. And when thinking about how to conduct, how Clay would be conducting himself in this situation, I'm always asking, well, what if this were me? How would I react to this situation? I'd definitely be calling my kids. Especially if I thought I might never speak to them again. I'd be calling my kids. And also it creates that sense of juxtaposition and contrast between this sort of like very workaday, normal, familiar conversation with the kids where she's talking about that she had pizza for dinner, and that's the most important thing to her because she's 3, and that makes sense for her. And Clay's state of mind, which is this highly stressed, I'm in big trouble, my brother may be in big trouble, and I got a murder to solve. The contrast of those two things, I find that very, very interesting.
You want to add to that, John?
I have nothing more to say to that.
Okay.
Although
Well, then I have a question,
Yeah.
which is, Clay is an officer of the law as well as, in the coroner's office, and it comes up 2 or 3 times where somebody references him or mistakes him for a cop, as it may be. But he clearly goes somewhat rogue in this book because of, his, and I'm not sure whether it's, well, you can talk about it. Why does he do that? I mean, he actually could be putting his whole career in jeopardy with some of the actions.
He is putting it in jeopardy because of his brother, because this is different. This is not just a professional coming in, looking at a body, making a notification. This is my brother part of this? And if so, how? And that drives him. He's already been stretching the boundaries a little bit with the previous book. He worked privately on the side. So yes, he's not a goody two-shoes. And I think that's one of the elements, and there are many that contributes to the tension of this book. It's a constant feeling of tension in this book, and that's one of them. What's going to happen to him? What's his future? And he's definitely stretching the boundaries and crossing them.
You want to add to that, Jesse?
Nope, that's exactly right.
Perfect.
He's on thin ice all the time.
Yeah, in this book, Clay is on thin ice. It's a good way to put it.
And, you know, he's also interested, I don't mean climbing a career ladder, but there is a reference in this book to whether he's going to rise to a slightly higher job on the force.
Yeah,
Right.
because
But
that's just human.
yeah, well, of course it is. And besides, you know, you can't really stay in one job forever in a lot of organizations. I mean, almost all policing organizations and so forth, don't they have some sort of slightly military structure?
Yes,
Where, you know,
police are paramilitary. There's no question. Jerry Petrovich, I don't know whether you knew Jerry,
yeah,
but he
no,
lived
I
in
know who
Diane
he
Alley.
is.
And Jerry was a Secret Service agent, and he used to say, every police department's paramilitary, every single one. If
So
not
rising
downright
in the
military.
ranks would be, you
Yeah.
know, not a natural thing to want to
Absolutely.
be doing.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Jesse, one of the other things I thought was really fascinating, and I'm not sure whether you brought it out that much before, but in this book, because the initial homicide that brings Clay, you know, into the story, this guy is one of these super rich, you know, and he's got one of those ridiculous houses. And as Clay, I love the way he goes into the house and he recognizes that the guy just kept collecting things. I didn't think about your guitars, Jonathan.
Exactly.
Okay.
You know, inspiration.
But we'll get to cars in a minute. But anyway, what I didn't know, and Jesse, why don't you tell us a bit about it, was that the coroner in Alameda County is a custodian, not just of the, you know, the things we've talked about, but he's really the custodian of this guy's property. And there's a lot of pressure on him and his colleagues to try to secure all of, because there's clearly going to be a dispute over the estate, you know, the executor and the son and so forth.
Right.
Is that just in Alameda County?
I think it's a fairly common occurrence for them to be the agency that's in charge of securing the property, right? That's why the coroner seal goes over a door to establish, security and a chain of custody for all the physical possessions. I think what is true most of the time, we allude to this in the book, is that a lot of people who end up as coroner's cases don't have a lot of physical possessions to take custody of. Unfortunately, that's the unfortunate reality, is that a lot of coroner's cases are people in indigent circumstances. It's very unusual for them to have an estate the size of the one that we describe in the book. I'll tell you one quick story, which was told to me by a coroner friend. We wanted to work this into the book somehow, but it just didn't make it in. We had a whole paragraph on this, and then it just didn't belong, so we cut it. But you know, they will go into houses not knowing what they're going to find. And my friend Sergeant Wilson, who was a coroner, she on like her first day out on the job as a coroner, she went into the home of this elderly man who had passed away. He was in his 90s. He was living alone, and they went into his apartment, and it was a tiny little apartment, and she heard laughter coming from the next room, and she goes in, and her colleague is standing there, and he's opened up the man's closet, and there's an enormous stack of magazines, thousands of magazines stacked up, and it's all vintage pornography. He has pornography going back. He has like Playboy issue 1, Penthouse issue 1 stacked up in his closet. And I said to her, I said, that stuff's worth a lot of money. So what happened with it? She said, we didn't know what to do with it because we couldn't take it all back to the office. Obviously, there's no place to put all of that. So we called his relatives, and the relatives, they were so embarrassed by it that they ended up destroying all of it. They destroyed everything, thousands of dollars worth of stuff. But she told me the story by way of illustrating that is extremely atypical. I'll tell you one. Sorry, now I'm thinking of all these other stories, which is this is another true story. This happened in my neighborhood. An elderly man died. I don't know why it's always a solo elderly man. Elderly man died in his 90s. No relatives, no close relatives, no immediate family, only distant relatives. When the police went into his house to look around, they discovered he was a weapons collector. And they discovered in his basement hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of guns, bunch of gun safes, as well as a bunch of live grenades. And so they shut the whole neighborhood down for blocks, and they had to bring in the bomb squad. And so I was typing at my desk, and I got a visit from the coroner knocked on my door. They said, please don't go outside for the next 2 hours. Don't let your children go outside for the next 2 hours. The bomb squad is here. We have to remove all of this essentially ordinance that was in this man's basement. But those are the exceptional stories. A lot of the time, especially up here in and around Oakland, you're much more likely to be dealing with a drug overdose in a motel, or someone who is homeless who has passed away of exposure in an alleyway, than somebody with a gigantic car barn or an enormous collection of weapons. Those are the cases that are exceptional.
Yeah, there's always a crime scene, and the key is to establish it and block it off and take control of it. The other time you get a huge crime scene is when there's an outdoor shooting involving lots of people, and you could have casings that go on for blocks. And that's a nightmare for a detective, a nightmare. But here also, you're going to this massive house, and just searching it is a whole different experience than a 15 by 10 motel room, which is the more typical crime scene or death scene.
Well, I couldn't help but think of you, since I have witnessed your own car collection out there in front of your house. So what looks like a guest house away from this mega mansion and a mega guest house turns out to be, in fact, something different. And I love the 30 cars. Of course, the muscle car is the key here. But did you have fun figuring out what cars this guy actually was collecting?
Well, I'm a car guy. Jesse is not.
Right.
So here's where I had some expertise. But I've learned, and I don't have that many cars. I have a few, but some of these guys have hundreds of cars or dozens of cars. And apparently private car museums are quite frequent all across the country. So there's quite a bit of that. I have a couple of friends who have massive car collections, but collecting, it's a strange thing. It's a form of OCD. So,
Well, I mean, you could have had him find a stash of like guitars, for example, or
oh
something
yeah, who
else.
would do that?
But instead you had cars. I mean,
Yeah.
you're talking to somebody who has staged, for over 20 years events in Clive Cussler's local car museum.
Yeah, he had a hell of a collection.
Yeah, a really, really fabulous collection. I don't know that I've been in anything much that equals your guitar collection. I can't, I know you've written a wonderful book about it, but it's hard for me to, can't you bring it into some one of your novels with Jesse? I mean, they're just so magnificent.
Maybe, who knows?
Maybe, who knows?
I never say never now that you mention it.
Yeah, Clay could take custody of some astonishing car collection.
Yeah,
Jesse.
really.
Why not?
Exactly.
I mean, I do think, you should mix it up. And while maybe the hotel room and the overdose is the more normal thing, how much do readers really want to read about that as compared to something more exotic?
Right.
Well, we try to reflect reality in the sense that there's both, but the one of the hallmarks of the series, and this is true both in this book as well as the previous books, is you get sort of the big exceptional cases, the complicated cases, and those are the sort of the story backbone for most of the novels. But there's also all the everyday death that Clay has to keep investigating while he's doing these big cases, because people never stop dying. People and they never stop dying in ways that need investigation. And so you get interspersed these little vignettes of strange or accidental or sad death that pop up both in this book and all the previous books. And those, in some ways, those are almost those are like little bonbons of stories. And others, I think personally, I really enjoy working on those because they give you a sense. They give you like you get 3 pages to do this. It's almost like a short story embedded within the larger story.
So, John, what would you like to ask Jesse? I'm sort of done with all my questions.
Well, I just want to make just comment on something that you said, Barbara, which is, but do people want to read about that? Generally not. When I first started out, people kept saying, well, how is it different being a psychologist and being a novelist? And when I finally came up with it, I used to say it, as a psychologist, we're trained to try to develop rules of human behavior. We look at the rules of human behavior. As a novelist, I'm dealing with the exceptions. I'm dealing with the exceptions to the rules. Now you can you still want to do it with a semblance of reality. Like one thing always irritates me when I look at shows on TV. Every time they show someone being interrogated, it's like a World War II movie. He's in a dark room with a light on it. If you know what a real interrogation room is, it's fluorescent, it's bright. But the cliche has become this dark room. So you try to establish your own reality, but the truth is, it's like dialogue. You write dialogue that seems realistic, but it never is. Because if you wrote realistic dialogue, it would be full of ums and ahs and pauses, and people don't want to read that. And why should they? So that's the key. You're trying to create a false reality. And that's the fun of it, because you get to make stuff up.
So Jesse wrote 5 absolutely wonderful novels, all of which I loved, but they were all different. None of them, was a series sort of a thing. And you yourself have written some, standalones, but you've written, I've lost track of how many Alex Delawares. I mean,
Probably close to 40 at this point.
Yeah, I mean, I could count them. They're here in the book, but I didn't do that. So I guess a question for you I would have is, does writing with Jesse and doing something different, is that a break from Alex? Do you get to, do other stuff, exercise any different part of your brain?
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's all about variety. And we kind of fell into collaboration by accident. And we found that we enjoyed it so much that we kept doing it. And it's been great. Books have been doing well and people appreciate them. And I love my son and I love writing with him. It's because he's a great writer.
Oh, he is a great writer. I agree. I mean, I'm a huge fan of your standalones.
Amazing.
Jesse, do you ever feel, that you might want to write another book on your own?
He's working on one.
I very much feel this is like my white whale. I have this book that I think I've talked to you about this a little bit in the past, Barbara.
Yes, we have.
It's just still going on. Incredibly, 10 years later. So it just in one sentence, I've been working on this book that is draws on events from my family history. It's a very, very, very complicated piece of family history, something that I only became aware of when I was about 30 years old. And I've had to gather I've been gathering documents on it for the last decade. Probably if I weren't doing the books with my dad, I probably would have gotten to it sooner. But we're under contract. We keep going back to write more Clay books, which is not to say that I don't love doing them, because I did. I do. I wouldn't do them otherwise. But it means that I get to work on this thing in 2-month increments, sort of between Clay books. I'm proud to report that after 10 years of wool gathering and 10 years of paper gathering, this spring, after we finished the draft, the final draft of The Burning, I was like, dude, you gotta put something on paper. This is inexcusable. So I sat down and I typed out about 30 pages, just as a proof of concept, just to say, is this a book? Is there even a story here? And I started writing it, and I was very nervous, and I gave it to my wife. I said, is this a book? I can't even tell at this point if this is a book or just a really weird hobby that I have. And so I gave it to her, and she just was ecstatic. She said, you got to work on this. You got to do it. So that gave me a shot in the arm. And it is fully my intention to start it in earnest in the near future. It also doesn't help that I have another collaborative project that I work on with another friend, Owen King, who is Stephen King's son, is a buddy of mine, and he and I got the idea to collaborate on a comic book. So we've been working on that together. So my attention is, and I have lots of little children, so my attention is extremely divided. But I have never lost the flame of this other book. Is perpetually burning in my heart. So I will get to it.
I suspect that the discipline of writing a Clay book every year and a half frees Jesse up to take a leisurely pace researching this other book. And he probably enjoys that because it's so different.
Pretty scary to have a father that can analyze you, Jerry.
I never did. But now that we're talking about, I was always, you can ask my kids. In fact, most of them told me, yeah, thanks for not treating us like a patient. I really didn't bring it home, and I wasn't that kind of psychologist.
No,
Anyway.
you're a wonderful father, John. You
Oh,
really are.
thank you.
I mean, you're like a beacon for,
Well,
for you and Faye together. Just
it's
amazing
it's
parents.
really their sensible Midwestern mother who gets all the credit, because I don't know what I would have done without her. But I just think that Jesse has really enjoyed doing this other book, which is a mega book in the way it should be done, collecting enormous amounts of, as we have learned, very shocking data, a lot of crazy stuff. We won't say more, but there's a lot of crazy stuff in there. And when he finally does write it, it's going to be fascinating. Absolutely.
Wow. Well, I've really enjoyed. Jesse has explored the art world, wrote a wonderful book about writers. Interestingly enough, both of you, this has been a year in which writers have figured so heavily into so many books. They're either the investigator, or they're the victim,
Oh, really?
or I mean, I've just been astonished at how many. You could look at Jean Half Correlates the Plot, which I thought was a really fabulous book. Also funny in a way, because we did her book lunch, and she said she was surprised that it turned out to be a crime novel, because she didn't write it that way. It's just, or didn't conceive it that way, I should say, but it did turn out to be, to fall into that. And I've wondered, during the pandemic, when we're more isolated and home and all, whether writers have turned to themselves more often than they might have had, to explore. Jesse, why did you write your book about a writer? Was it the story, or was it you wanted to explore being a writer?
It was primarily story driven. I would say that, one of the things that is one of sort of my abiding intellectual passions is for people who live in very, very small specific worlds, subcultures. Probably, I don't know, at the risk of analyzing myself, I mean, we are, as observant Jews, are members of a very small specific subculture. And I'm very interested in the way small specific cultures and subcultures and the people that belong to them relate to the larger society. Because certainly in my own experience as an observant Jew, I do not, and this may be the luxury of my generation, I don't feel alienated or separate from the broader culture, broader American culture. At the same time, there is this very distinctive sense of there are things that differentiate me from what I see on television and what I see in the movies. So any sort of subculture that brings with it a set of strict mores and expectations is a fascination and relatable to me. Hence, writing about the art world, because that's exactly what the art world is. It's this very rarefied subculture. And I think that my experience, the book that I wrote that involved the writer, that was my fifth book. By that point, I'd been living in the writer's world for a few years, and I'd gone to a lot of conferences, and I had done a lot of events like this with you. And so I was sort of keenly tapped into what it means to be a member of this very small, very intimate, and I will add, very wonderful community. Yeah. And so I guess that was how I came to it more than anything else, rather than as an attempt to explore the writing process itself, which has never been sort of, it's never something I felt I could write about and make it interesting. Surely there are people who can, but I didn't think that I could do that. So that book is about a writer, yes, but it's mostly about sort of like what it means to be a crime writer, with all that entails in terms of tragic and comic potential.
Well, should we call Patrick back and see if we have questions from the audience?
Absolutely.
Here he comes. I love your skull there, Patrick. Is that look at that, a new thing.
Very Hamlet-like, isn't it?
I'm surprised he doesn't have a guitar up there, John, since the two of you, are so into them.
Yeah, I need to see that collection one of these days.
Come out and visit. Come out and visit.
You still have all the Weisenborns and all that great stuff?
Yeah.
Wow.
Okay. Mostly been playing classical. But
are you still playing the oud?
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Quite a bit. Yeah, it's great.
Wonderful. Let's see. There are some questions here. Jamie is asking, do coroners have medical degrees? So maybe just a brief difference between the ME and coroner.
So again, it does vary from place to place. In Alameda County, where we're writing, no, they do not have medical degrees. They're law enforcement officers. The people who have medical degrees are the pathologists who conduct the autopsy. And usually the coroner is around for the autopsy. They like to attend when they can the autopsy, because obviously that bears on how they're going to determine the manner of death. But at present, there are no people with medical degrees working as coroners in Alameda County Sheriff's Department. There were civilians, and as my dad said, prior to about 8 years ago, there were civilians working there, and some of them did have medical or medical adjacent careers before coming to the coroner's office. But it's not their job to cut the body up and look and trace the path of the bullets. That's the pathologist's job. And actually, one of the pathologists at Alameda County, Judy Melanik, has written a book of her own about being a pathologist.
In Los Angeles, the coroner is an MD. Thomas Noguchi is the one we all remember because he wrote a book called Coroner. But in most small jurisdictions, it's a guy who owns a funeral parlor, could be a sheriff.
An elected
some
position, correct?
Pardon me?
It is an elected position too, is it
It
not?
can be, yeah, usually is sometimes that's appointed. One thing about America, we're different from Europe. We're not one country, we're 50 states, and within each state, lots of jurisdictions. There's a lot of variety in this country, which is part of what makes it wonderful.
Well, coroner is a really ancient position.
Yeah.
It's an ancient
Yes.
role. I mean, so, if you read English history or historical mystery or same thing, you run across coroners. So it's
well, the one who really pushed for it being an MD was Milton Halperin, who was the chief medical examiner of New York City, and he wrote a lot. And he was really, really pushing, because up till that time, really, the doctors were hired, but they could even bring in freelance guys. It was, New York 150 years ago had, for example, several competing police departments that fought each other. It was very, if we think things are crazy now, it was much crazier then. You read Luke Sante's Low Life, in which he describes a brilliant book, and he talks about these, things were just, there were no rules. We have more rules today, but there's still plenty of exceptions. So the answer is yes and no, and not always.
Some of those Herbert Asbury books, like Gangs of New York and Barbary Coast, and those are fascinating.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay, there's a question here. You've dealt a little bit with this, but Nellie asks, what's the process of collaboration? Alternating chapters or another method? And do you use a master document that you both work on?
Well, we do have an outline, and we spend a lot of time devising this outline. We tend to do whole drafts, passing them back and forth, rather than a chapter here, a chapter. That's too fragmented. So what we've evolved, and I did that with Faye too, do a whole draft, then someone else takes over, and we keep passing it back and forth and refining it and self-editing until we're happy with it. Beyond that, we'll leave it mysterious. Anything else?
Let's see. People are just saying, what a great job you do with the forensics. Other than that, not a whole lot of questions, just fans saying how much they enjoy both of your work. Let's see, anything else new? Finally, there is a new question. Cecile says, any plans for movies or TV shows from your collaborative works?
We tried. I think a couple of years ago, we actually went around and did some pitches to all the streaming services, and we were trying to pitch Delaware, and there's no interest. In fact, we met with Amazon and got a very frosty reception, and the guy said, frankly, if we were buying it today, we wouldn't buy Bosch. And I said, well, it's in its 7th year, so why would you say that? But so far nothing imminent, but we'll see. We'll see. If you was in a position to do it, we're happy to work with you.
Yeah, the collaborative stuff, we've each had our own experiences dealing with Hollywood, and I think how can I put this nicely? We've learned to enjoy the process of writing a novel as an end in and of itself, and not as a launching pad for anything else. I mean, that was always true. We always came to this as writers first, not looking to write a novel that would function as a storyboard. Hollywood is a place where the incentives are different than they are in the publishing world, and it's not a place that I think writers like us feel very happy working in. If people want to make the books into television or movies, we're very happy to work with them. But the relentless BS that comes along with it, and the relentless meeting taking, is just something we like collaborating with each other. I love to collaborate with my dad. I like to collaborate with Owen because he's a good friend, but that doesn't mean we want to deal with everybody and everybody and their grandmother in putting a project together. And that's necessary to make a TV show or a movie, because there are hundreds and hundreds of people involved. I think, if the situation were right and we felt that somebody was passionate about it and committed to bringing the books to the screen in a way that we approve of, we'd be more than happy to assist and help. But I think a lot of times the level of compromise that is entailed in a collaborative process is just not something that interests us terrifically much.
I mean, I've had a lot of deals that fell through. I've made a lot of money off options back in the old days, and I think Jesse has a book that's been optioned at this point too. So it's just, my example is the Elmore Leonard book, Get Shorty. And if you recall, either the movie or the book, it's a very interesting premise. You have this guy, the protagonist, who is an arm buster for the mob in Florida. So he's a gangster, he's a thug, he breaks people's arms, he's violent. John Travolta played him beautifully. And his name is Chili, I think. And then he comes to Hollywood, and he's just appalled by these terrible people that he meets. So I think that was Dutch's way of telling what he thought about Hollywood. It's an interesting business. I never had a big interest in it. I both of us grew up in LA. And when I was 21, I won a Goldwyn Award, which at the time was a stepping stone to film writing. Francis Ford Coppola won a Goldwyn. I was 21, I won a Goldwyn. And agents were with big cigars in those days were calling me, well, kid, what do you want to do? I said, well, I'm going to get a PhD in psychology. And they looked at me, are you crazy? So it didn't appeal to me. I wanted to write books. I wanted to write something with pages and a cover. Although in this case, it's ebooks, but still, it's still a book. So I've never been attracted to the film business, ever, despite being an LA kid. And Jesse also. Jesse was born in LA.
Well, let's be real too. Although you're willing to write with Jesse and Faye, you're not a committee guy. I mean, you really are, John.
No.
When I left academic medicine, I vowed never to attend another meeting again. And then the governor appointed me to the Cancer Commission, so I did that because I thought it was a good cause. But beyond that, I have never gone to another meeing.
Jesse, did you have something to add? I'm sorry, I walked.
Just that, novelists are people who I think are very content to be working with. It's rare that you're able to collaborate with somebody in the way that my dad and I are able to collaborate, where there is not a sense of having to constantly give in. It really is a sense of the whole being greater than the sum of its parts. The collaborative process that's necessary for film is something that I think can be a drag on somebody who's used to having total control. We're control freaks. All novelists are control freaks. They're little mini deities. That's why you do it, because you get to make all the rules. So
it's the closest thing to playing God, really.
Yeah.
And there's no term limits, so it's great.
It's true, and you get to design your own universe. You get to create your own.
Exactly right.
So before we leave, we've mentioned, or you both have mentioned, that you have already been working on a 5th book for Clay. John, knowing you well, you probably finished an Alex Delaware for February, when I hope we can talk about it. But you want to give us just a little preview there?
I have a book in February. And I have another book finished that's coming out, the following one. And right here is about 300 pages of a book coming out in 3 years, or 2 years, 2.5 years. So the pandemic has really helped my
You know, it's
my
interesting.
creativity.
Some people have been more productive and some people have not been able to write. It all,
Yeah, no,
there's
it's
so
been-
many different actions, and I can't help but feel in the journal the other day, there was an article and the headline is, "Why are so many adults having tantrums?" You know, and I,
well,
true, you know, thinking about, you know, flying and other just insane
Yeah.
kinds of
Well,
behavior, you
I'm not
know.
going to say it hasn't been stressful. It's been terrible for everyone, but honestly, it's been much less disruptive for Faye and myself, because even before the pandemic, we basically stayed home and typed. So we are
Right.
restricted, and there was a time I couldn't see my kids and my grandkids and
Yeah.
friends, and that was, I'm not saying it wasn't hard, but I think we suffered less than most people. So the book coming out in February is called City of the Dead. The one following that is called Unnatural History, and this book is called The Ghost Orchid.
Oh, I love
So
the ghost orchid.
Isn't
Wow,
that good?
terrific.
Yeah.
Well, I will look forward to talking to you in February then.
Always
And
welcome.
Jesse, if you want to join in, I mean, we should just keep up the family party, even if you're not a co-author. We
Sounds
could,
good.
or we
We
could
can-
have Faye too, because actually
Okay.
last February we did that Alex Delaware with Faye, didn't we? So
Yeah,
it's great.
yeah, no, it's always
Well,
fun.
Thank you, guys. Let me
Thank you,
remind
Barbara.
everybody that the burning, we have copies coming signed by Jesse and by Jonathan, which should be here early next week, UPS willing. And hopefully they won't have played soccer with every carton so that they'll arrive in reasonably good shape. But anyway, thank you so much for watching us this evening. There'll be a podcast available for this conversation probably tomorrow. So if you know people who might be interested in listening to the podcast, please tell them. The video is going to live on our webpage, our Facebook page at poisonpen.com forever. So you can recommend people go there as well. So thank you, guys.
Thank you, Barbara. It's always a pleasure.
Thank you, Barbara.
Good
It is a
night.
great pleasure to spend time with you, and it's a pleasure to spend time with all of you who are watching this. And thank you, Patrick, as ever, for all your wonderful help. Good night.
No problem.
Good night.
Good night.